Hello, my name is Eric Putkonen. Thank you for joining me. Today I'm going to be talking about non-duality and the higher self. Now I know there's a lot of teachings, even scriptures, uh, Hindu or Advaita Vedanta scriptures, especially when they're translated into English, will sometimes make reference to a higher self. And I think this is really a poor pointer, because when you talk about a higher self, you imply there's a lower self, something that exists. And when the lower self is talked about, they're talking about the ego, the doer, the thinker, um, the little me. And so then this dichotomy or struggle arises of how do I, the lower self, realize or find the higher self? And that is actually not right, because there are not multiple selves. There is only the self. You are already the higher self. When they talk about higher self, they're usually talking about the self. But you're already the self. The issue is that in thought and belief, you don't understand or realize you are the self. You misidentify as the body, as the mind, as the ego, as the doer, as the thinker. This is all misidentification. This lower self doesn't really exist. It's a fiction of the mind. And so I think it's very poor in these teachings, because the implication or what comes across to a lot of people is they assume, oh, I'm the lower self. And so then they identify as the lower self. And they think the higher self is somewhere else. It's something to be realized or found. And that's not the case. You are the self already, whether you realize this or not. You are the self playing as a body mind, believing it's the doer, the thinker, and the ego. But this mental belief and illusion within the body mind does not exist, does not create a separate self. There's only the self, and there is no other. That's the whole premise of Advaita Vedanta. Advaita being not two, or as it translates into English, non-dual. The whole basis of non-duality is there is no other. There is only the self. The self is all there is. And so I wanted to point out today that although there are some teachers and teachings and even scriptures that talk about a higher self, don't get too caught up in the whole idea of a higher self. There isn't a higher self. There's only the self. And as they talk about the higher self and then they talk about the lower self, realize that lower self is an illusion. It doesn't really exist. It's misidentification with the body mind, the ego, that creates this idea of a me other than the self. The lower self is a misidentification. And don't further compound this by thinking that the lower self is something that exists and the higher self is something that exists, and so there's these two selves, and the lower self has to find or realize the higher self. That's just compounding the illusions. There's no lower self. It's a fiction. There's just the self. And so that's kind of all I wanted to talk about today. If you have any questions, post below. Any comments as well. If you want to share the video, feel free. But until next time, thank you much.